Welcome back to our series on Bach's Orgelbüchlein. And today we're looking at not one but two chorale preludes on Liebster Jesu, hier. Or is it one? In a sense, it's a musicology question, which we shouldn't really be interested in because this is all to do with performance. But at the same time, as performers, we do have that simple question: is this one piece or is it two? In other words, if we're playing the whole set, should we play one or other of them or both? So we'll try to answer that question along with the usual performance questions today. In any event, it's a chorale melody that Bach seems to be particularly fond of. As well as this pair of pieces here in Orgelbüchlein, he set chorale preludes on the same melody in the miscellaneous ones, the ones which don't belong to any particular collection and which have been numbered BWV 730 and 731. And there again, that's a pair of pieces which appear in some ways to be different stages of production of the same thing in its more perfect form as BWV 731. You'll obviously have realized that these short films are largely unscripted. And one of the unexpected things when I started making them was the extent to which I have to fight with myself not to say, oh, but this is such a wonderful piece, this is one of my favorites. I hadn't realized quite how fond I was of the individual pieces. But Liebster Jesu, yes, if I have to be absolutely honest with you, if I was to play a chorale prelude on that particular melody, I would be more likely to go for BWV 731. Not that this one in Orgelbüchlein or this pair in Orgelbüchlein isn't wonderful examples of a canon. And they do have this great romantic harmony in the last bar of each half. But at the same time, they seem to lack something of that easy lyricism that we find in 731, which is so attractive. They're not easy pieces to like at first hearing. But back to that question, why are there two Liebster Jesu chorale preludes in Orgelbüchlein? And why is the second one marked distinctius? Distinctius is not a normal musicological expression, it's not something you'll find anywhere else. So what does that mean? Once you get beyond the first bar, the two versions are more or less identical, and the first bar is only superficially different between them. So why did Bach write it out twice? The only real difference between the two is that the Distinctius version is written out on 3 staves, so with a separate stave for the pedal, whereas the first one is written in the usual way on 2 staves. I think, just off the spur of the moment, that this is the only place in the whole of Orgelbüchlein where Bach writes anything on 3 staves with the separate stave for the pedals. So one way of looking at it is that distinctius is a purely graphical matter. That is to say that the second version is more distinct, if you like, or clearer because it's written on 3 staves and rather more tidily than the first one. So by this way of thinking, Bach wrote it out once and then thought, well, it's a little bit difficult to see what's what. Let's write it out again, but this time on 3 staves. And so he wrote it out distinctly, distinctius, so more clearly. Well, that all seems quite straightforward, but there is a problem. We know, we talked about it in the introductory video, that Bach's procedure in compiling the Orgelbüchlein was that he got himself a notebook, or he created a notebook, and then ruled out all the staves, and then wrote out on the tops of each page the names of the pieces which he was going to write. And for those pieces which had a shorter chorale melody, or where he thought that the chorale prelude was going to be relatively short, he allocated himself 1 page. And for those with a longer chorale melody, or where he thought that his figuration was going to create a longer piece, he gave himself 2 pages. And he very, very rarely overestimated the amount of space he would need. In fact, in many cases, he underestimated it so that he had to squash things into the margins, or run over onto the next page, or in a couple of places glue in extra bits of paper to fill in the space which would be needed. So he never actually left empty space in the book. I think there is one place, the canon on Olam Gottes, if I remember rightly, where there's half of a line empty, and in fact the first of these two Liebster Jesu versions leaves half a line empty at the end of a page. But that's about the most empty space he ever actually leaves. It's entirely unheard of for him to leave a whole empty page anywhere. And yet, if this is true, that Bach wrote out the first Liebster Jesu version and then decided that he needed to tidy it up a bit and wrote out a second one, then that would mean that he must have left an empty page when he wrote out his title headings, which seems exceedingly unlikely. There is no reason for him to have assumed in advance that this chorale prelude was going to need 2 pages, and yet he left 2 pages for it. What's the explanation? I've no idea. I can't answer it, but it is a puzzle. He can't really have been intending originally to write 2 chorale preludes, both on Liebster Jesu, because it's the whole point of the collection, in a sense, is that there is 1 chorale prelude for each chorale. There is nowhere where he writes 2. There are actually 2 places where he'd put 2 single pages available for the same hymn title. One of those was In dich hab ich gehofft, Herr, and the other was Alle Menschen müssen sterben. And in both of those cases, he'd written the title on one page and alio modo on the facing page, thus leaving 2 pages for the same title. But in both of those cases, he actually composed something on the alio modo page and left the original page empty. In those 2 cases, though, there were 2 or 3 alternative melodies for the particular hymn text. So in dich hab ich gehofft, Herr, there are 2 melodies, both of which Bach uses in different places, and so it was the alio modo, the other version, which he wrote the chorale prelude on. And in the sense that there were 2 alternative melodies, it's logical that he would write 2 different pieces, 1 for each chorale melody. The same is true with Alle Menschen müssen sterben. There are actually 3 chorale melodies that Bach sets from time to time. And he has chosen, presumably, to make chorale preludes on 2 of them, but ended up only writing the second one. That's not the case with Liebster Jesu. There is no alternative melody that I know of, at least. And he didn't write alio modo on the right-hand page. So that explanation doesn't really quite hold water either. The only explanation I can suggest is that throughout the whole of the collection, Bach always, when he's going to leave 2 pages available for a chorale prelude, he always leaves 2 facing pages, so there's never a page turn there. The only exception, the only place where there is a page turn is in Christ ist erstanden, which occupies 3 pages, and therefore there has to be a page turn. But otherwise, he's very careful to lay out the book, always in such a way that for a double-page chorale prelude, the 2 pages are spaced, are facing each other. So that means that whenever he has a double page, the item on the previous page is always either a single page chorale prelude or another double page one, so that there is never a page turn left over. The chorale that was due to follow Liebster Jesu was a double page one, Gott Vater und Spy, and perhaps Bach just couldn't find something to put into the page immediately preceding it and left it blank in the first place. It seems extremely unlikely because he never did that anywhere else in the book. It's a very thin explanation, but it's the only one that I can actually offer. Perhaps you've got a better idea. You can make a suggestion in the comments below. Well, it's a lot of fun speculating, but we're supposed to be talking about performance here, and the performance question that we're answering with all this is that we can be quite safe in concluding that this is just two versions of the same piece. It's not two separate pieces at all. So if you're playing the whole collection, then you only need to play one or other of them. The later one is the one which is numbered BWV 633, which is slightly bizarre because the earlier one has been numbered 634 in the Bach Gesellschaft edition, and who knows why. But the later one seems to be the distinctious version. So I'll play just the second one today, the 633. So at last we can turn to the details of performance. And the first detail is obviously that the melody in the right hand is as a canon. Wherever you get a canon, you have to be very careful and deliberate about the phrase endings. So, for instance, the upper voice has a phrase ending at the end of the second bar here, while the corresponding phrase ending in the lower part is in the middle of the following bar. Now, assuming you're taking a slowish tempo, we'll talk about that in just a moment, then it's reasonable to take a quaver rest at the end of that first phrase. In other words, turn the melody from a minim into a dotted crotchet and a quaver rest. It's a good idea to be so deliberate about it, just to make it easier for the hearer to follow and for us not to forget. The two melody parts end together at the end of the second phrase and of the final phrase, but the third phrase ends on a crotchet. And even there, actually, I would play a quaver plus a quaver rest. The second point is that the right hand is marked F and the left hand is marked P. In other words, it's intended to be played on two manuals, something that's mentioned incidentally in the first version, but not in so many words in the second version. F and P in this instance are merely relative terms. It doesn't mean that one is particularly loud or that the other is particularly quiet, merely that they're different and that we're talking about a melody and an accompaniment. There are several pairs of ornaments here, and I use the term pair because we're talking about a canon, and so when you get an ornament in one voice, you always get it in the next. So of the four pairs of trills, two of the pairs are cadential trills, that is, they mark the cadences at the end of each half of the piece. And in both cases, the trill starts on the upper auxiliary. So far as the upper voice is concerned, it's awkward to keep the trill going for a full minim. That demands trilling on the weakest fingers. It can be done, but it sounds a bit contrived. Perhaps it's better to trill for the first crotchet only and then do the same in the lower voice, not because you have to, but in order to be consistent. But the first two pairs of trills present us with a problem of quite a different sort. I won't go into details of the theory here, and I'll refer you to our episode on playing ornaments. That was the episode on Vater unser im Himmelreich for all the background. So let's look first at the lower voice in bar 2. If we start our trill on the upper auxiliary, as the convention dictates, then it means repeating the A, which is already on the offbeat note in the other voice. And that's clumsy and disruptive, and it obscures the melody, which is a problem when we're talking about the lower voice in a canon, where you really need the melody to be very clear. In other words, it's sensible to start the trill on the G sharp, even though that's the main note. And if anybody wants to excommunicate you for doing that, then you can tell them from me to get a life. I'm actually going to start the first trill from the main note as well, for the reasons that I go into on the Vater unser episode, and I'm not going to go into here. So finally, tempo. Everything says that it's going to be pretty slow. There is, first of all, the harmonic rhythm, which is moving largely in quavers, which means that, again, the tempo is going to be pretty steady. Secondly, there is such a level of complexity here, both in the harmony and in the fact that it's a canon. So you're going to want to be really quite deliberate in order to help the listener to hear the details. So a slow and steady tempo, depending a little bit, obviously, on the context in which you're playing it and the place where you're playing it.